At 3:17 a.m. on the morning of February 12, 1943, the North Atlantic was a black throat-swallowing sound, light and hope in equal measure. The wind screamed across the deck of HMCS Chaudière, a river-class destroyer escort assigned to convoy SC-118, slicing through swells that rose like liquid mountains under a sky choked with cloud. Salt crusted every surface, freezing on railings, stinging eyes, and coating the lips of men who hadn't slept in 36 hours. Below decks, in the belly of the ship where heat and noise pressed against the skin like a second uniform, leading mechanics mate Elias Crowe wiped grease from his brow with a rag already saturated in oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. The bilge pumps had failed again. This time not with a groan or a stutter, but with a silence so sudden it felt like betrayal. Crowe wasn't an officer. He wasn't even a warrant rank. At 28, he'd spent more time elbow-deep in engine rooms than on dry land, his hands permanently stained with the residue of diesel, rust, and seawater. Born in St. John, New Brunswick, to a fisherman who'd lost 3 brothers to the U-boat war of 1917. Elias had joined the Royal Canadian Navy not out of patriotism, but necessity. A steady wage, 3 meals a day, and the illusion of control in a world unraveling. Now, crouched beside pump number 3 in compartment B4, he listened to the absence of sound, the way a hunter listens for the breath of prey. The ship groaned around him, steel contracting in the cold, pipes shuddering with the pulse of distant depth charges. But the pump, once a steady, reassuring thrum, was dead. He'd reported the issue twice already, first to Petty Officer Mallory, who'd grunted, "She'll hold till dawn," then to Lieutenant Commander Vickers, who'd barely glanced up from his chart table. "It's the cold," Vickers had said, voice clipped, eyes fixed on the plotted positions of U-boat wolfpacks converging from the Reykjanes Ridge. "Everything freezes up out here. Just keep her running as best you can." But Elias knew it wasn't the cold. Not really. The cold didn't explain why pump number 3 failed only when the ship turned hard to starboard. It didn't explain the faint, rhythmic vibration that preceded each shutdown, a vibration he'd felt through the soles of his boots during the last 3 attacks, a vibration no one else seemed to notice or care about. Now, with water rising 3 inches per hour in the aft bilge, and the convoy already reeling from the loss of the Empire Redshank and SS William C. Gorgas just hours before, Elias made a decision that would later be called reckless, insubordinate, and borderline mutinous. He bypassed the main control panel, rerouted auxiliary power from the starboard generator, and jury-rigged a bypass valve using a spare pressure regulator from the freshwater system and a length of copper tubing scavenged from a decommissioned boiler feed line. His hands moved without hesitation, guided by a lifetime of watching machines breathe, choke, and die. He didn't ask permission. He didn't file a work order. He simply turned the valve, flipped the switch, and held his breath as the pump coughed, sputtered, and then roared back to life with a sound like a drowning man, breaking the surface. Water began receding. The ship stabilized. But the real anomaly wasn't the pump. It was the silence that followed. For the first time in weeks, the hydrophone operator in the sonar shack reported something strange. The U-boats. "They're not hearing us," he'd whispered into the intercom, voice trembling. "We just passed within 800 meters of U-221's last known position, and they didn't react. Not a twitch." Elias didn't understand sonar. He didn't know cavitation from calibration. But he knew machines, and he knew that when a ship's pumps ran unevenly, when they stuttered or surged, they created harmonic vibrations that traveled through the hull and into the water like a drumbeat in the dark. And drumbeats, he realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the Atlantic cold, could be heard. Over the next 48 hours, as SC-118 limped toward the western approaches, with 6 ships lost and morale shattered, Elias began to notice a pattern. Every time a vessel's bilge system malfunctioned, especially those with the older Mark IV rotary pumps. The hydrophone operators aboard escorts would report increased U-boat activity in their vicinity. Conversely, ships with stable pump rhythms like the Chaudière after his fix seemed to vanish from the acoustic landscape. He mentioned it once to Mallory during a cigarette break on the aft deck, the wind snatching the words from his lips. "You're saying U-boats are hunting us by the sound of our pumps?" Mallory laughed, exhaling smoke that vanished instantly into the gale. "Next, you'll tell me they're reading our laundry lists." Elias said nothing. He just watched the horizon, where the sea met sky in a seam of grey nothingness, and wondered how many men had died because no one was listening to the wrong sounds. By the time Chaudière docked at Londonderry on February 20th, Elias had filled 3 pages of a water-stained notebook with observations: pump failure times, convoy headings, U-boat attack vectors, and hydrophone logs copied surreptitiously from the sonar room. He'd even sketched a crude diagram showing how pressure fluctuations in the bilge system could resonate through the keel, amplifying into low-frequency noise detectable at ranges exceeding 5 kilometers, well within the operational envelope of German passive sonar arrays like the GHG hydrophone. He took his notes to Engineering Officer Lieutenant Armitage, a Cambridge-educated engineer with a reputation for patience and precision. Armitage read them slowly, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing at the technical annotations. "This is imaginative, Crowe," he said finally, handing the pages back. "But bilge pumps operate at frequencies far below the threshold of German hydrophones. Their systems are tuned to propeller cavitation, engine harmonics, not auxiliary machinery." "But what if the pump noise modulates the propeller signature?" Elias pressed, voice low but urgent. "What if it's not the pump alone, but the way it interacts with the hull's resonance when the ship turns or accelerates?" Armitage sighed. "Even if that were true, and I stress if, there is no way to test it without diverting resources from active convoy duty. And frankly, the Admiralty has far more pressing concerns than the acoustic profile of a bilge pump." That night, Elias sat alone in the empty mess hall, the notebook open on the table, the hum of the base generator vibrating through the floor. Outside, rain drummed against the corrugated roof, a sound so ordinary it was invisible. But Elias heard it differently now. He heard rhythm, he heard signal, he heard death, and he made a decision. If no one would listen, he would prove it himself. He knew a ship scheduled for dry dock in 3 days, HMCS Assiniboine, a veteran destroyer recently damaged in a surface engagement with U-203. Her bilge system was nearly identical to Chaudière's, and more importantly, her captain, Commander John H. Jack Rutherford, was known for tolerating eccentricity, so long as it didn't sink his ship. Elias spent the next 2 nights drafting a proposal so technically dense it bordered on absurd, a controlled experiment to compare the acoustic signatures of 2 identical pumps, one stock, one modified with his bypass regulator, under simulated convoy maneuvers. He included calculations on fluid dynamics, resonance frequencies, and estimated detection ranges based on captured German sonar manuals. He even cited a 1938 Royal Navy acoustics report that had been shelved for lack of operational relevance. On the morning of February 23rd, he handed the proposal to Rutherford in person, standing at rigid attention in the captain's cabin, heart hammering against his ribs. Rutherford read it in silence, then looked up, eyes sharp as flint. "You realize this is unauthorized. If something goes wrong, you'll be court-martialed." "I know, sir. And if it works?" "Then maybe fewer men drown in the dark, sir." Rutherford studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Do it, but quietly. And if you break my ship, I'll have you scrubbing bilges with a toothbrush until VE Day." That evening, as fog rolled in from the Foyle estuary, Elias Crowe climbed aboard Assiniboine, toolbox in hand, notebook tucked in his pocket, and began the work that would either end his career or change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. The sea was calm, the night was still, and somewhere beneath the waves, U-boats waited, listening, but this time they would hear nothing at all. The dry dock at Lisahali was a cathedral of steel and silence, its concrete walls rising like the ribs of some beached leviathan, the air thick with the smell of tar, rust, and damp timber. HMCS Assiniboine sat cradled in the skeletal embrace of support beams, her hull exposed from keel to waterline, barnacles scraped clean, weld scars glowing faintly under floodlights. It was just after midnight on February 25, 1943, and the only sounds were the drip of condensation from overhead pipes, the distant clang of a night watchman's boot on metal grating, and the soft scrape of Elias Crowe's wrench against the housing of bilge pump number 2. He worked alone. Rutherford had granted him a 4-hour window between maintenance shifts, under strict orders that no one, not even the engineering petty officers, was to be informed. The risk was too great. If word leaked to Naval Intelligence or the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Directorate, the experiment would be shut down before it began. They'd call it a distraction, a waste of time, another mechanic's fantasy. So Elias moved like a ghost through the ship's entrails, guided by memory and the dim beam of a hooded flashlight, his breath fogging in the frigid air. His modification was deceptively simple, a pressure-dampening loop installed between the pump's discharge valve and the main bilge manifold. Constructed from a coiled section of flexible copper tubing, salvaged from a decommissioned freshwater heater, and fitted with a hand-adjusted regulator valve. The loop acted as a hydraulic shock absorber, smoothing out the pulsations caused by the rotary impeller's uneven flow. In theory, it should eliminate the harmonic spikes that Elias believed were broadcasting the ship's position like a beacon. But theory meant nothing in the Atlantic. Only water did. By 3:45 a.m., the modification was complete. Elias wiped his hands, checked the connections one last time, and climbed to the bridge, where Rutherford waited in the shadows. Coat collar turned up against the cold. "You're sure this won't compromise flood control?" The captain asked, voice low. "If the regulator fails, the system defaults to original configuration," Elias replied. "It's fail-safe," Rutherford nodded. "Then let's see if your hunch holds water, literally." At dawn, Assiniboine was refloated and moved to a quiet anchorage off Greencastle, away from convoy traffic and prying ears. Aboard the corvette HMCS Wetaskiwin, borrowed for the day, under the guise of routine sonar calibration, sat Lieutenant Armitage, now reluctantly assigned as observer, and a team of hydrophone operators equipped with the latest Type 144 ASDIC set. Elias stood on Assiniboine's bridge, heart pounding as Rutherford gave the order, "Begin maneuvers." Standard convoy pattern, zigzag, speed 10 knots, hard turns every 5 minutes. The engines growled to life. The ship surged forward, cutting through the glassy surface of Lough Foyle. Below, the bilge pumps engaged automatically as seawater seeped into the hull, a normal occurrence, even in calm seas. On Wetaskiwin, Armitage watched the sonar display with skeptical eyes. For the first 15 minutes, nothing unusual appeared. Then during a sharp 30-degree turn to port, the hydrophone operator stiffened. "Sir, we're picking up a rhythmic pulse from Assiniboine. Low frequency, irregular. Sounds like a heartbeat." Armitage frowned. "Play it through the headphones." He listened, and heard it, a faint stuttering thrum beneath the steady drone of the destroyer's engines, a sound that shouldn't be there. "Now," Rutherford's voice crackled over the radio, "switch to modified pump configuration." Elias, standing by the engineering console, turned the regulator valve 3 clicks clockwise. Silence. Not engine silence, acoustic silence. The rhythmic pulse vanished. The hydrophone operator on Wetaskiwin blinked. "It's gone, sir, completely." Armitage leaned forward. "Run it again." "Same maneuver, they did. Turn to starboard. Engines at 12 knots. The old pump configuration re-engaged. The pulse returned, stronger this time, clearer. Then the switch, the silence, again and again. Each time the result was identical. The unmodified pump emitted a detectable acoustic signature during maneuvers. The modified version did not. By noon, Armitage was pale. This shouldn't be possible, he muttered, staring at the sonar logs. The energy output is negligible. How could it carry that far? Because it's not about volume, Elias said quietly, joining them on Wetaskiwin's deck. It's about pattern. German hydrophones aren't just listening for noise, they're listening for rhythm. A ship's rhythm tells them speed, heading, even class. Disrupt that rhythm and you disappear. Armitage looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. You've been right all along, but validation came at a cost. That evening, as Assiniboine returned to port, a signal arrived from Western Approaches Command. Report immediately to Derby House. Bring all notes. Highest priority. Someone had talked, or perhaps the sea itself had whispered. In Liverpool, beneath the bomb-scarred streets of exchange flags, the nerve center of the Battle of the Atlantic pulsed with urgency. Derby House, known to insiders as the Citadel, was a labyrinth of map rooms, codebreakers, and exhausted officers tracking every U-boat, every convoy, every drop of fuel in the North Atlantic. Here intelligence was life, and Elias Crowe's unauthorized experiment had just become the most dangerous kind of intelligence, the kind that contradicted established doctrine. He arrived on February 27th, escorted by 2 Royal Marines, his notebook clutched like a shield. In room 37, a windowless chamber lit by green-shaded lamps, he faced a tribunal of men whose names carried weight across oceans. Captain F.J. Johnny Walker, legendary U-boat hunter. Commander Roger Wynne, head of the submarine tracking room. And Rear Admiral Max Horton himself, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. Horton, a man whose silence could freeze blood, studied Elias for a full minute before speaking. You tampered with naval equipment without authorization. You conducted an experiment that could have compromised a warship. And you bypassed chain of command. He paused. Explain yourself. Elias didn't flinch. I saved lives, sir. He laid out his evidence. Sonar logs, frequency analyses, convoy loss patterns correlated with pump failure reports. He spoke not as a mechanic, but as a witness to a hidden war. A war fought not with torpedoes, but with sound. Wynne leaned forward, eyes alight. If this is true, it means U-boats have been using bilge harmonics to refine their targeting during evasion maneuvers. That explains why some ships vanish from sonar during zigzags. They're not hiding. They're screaming, Walker grunted. I've lost 3 escorts that way. Thought it was bad luck. Horton stood. Walked to the map on the wall, a sprawling web of red and blue lines marking convoy routes and U-boat kills, and traced a finger along the path of SC-118. How many ships could this save? If every escort and merchantman in the North Atlantic adopted the modification, Elias said, I'd estimate 40 or more per month. A stunned silence filled the room. 40 ships, each carrying thousands of tons of food, fuel, tanks, boots, bullets, the very sinews of war. Horton turned. Then we implement it, immediately but quietly. If Dönitz learns we've silenced our pumps, he'll adapt. And we can't afford that, not yet. Elias was sworn to secrecy. His name would not appear in reports. His fix would be listed as Standard Maintenance Procedure Type B. No medals. No commendation, just a quiet order, disseminated to every shipyard from Halifax to Glasgow. Install pressure-dampening loops on all Mark IV bilge pumps. Effective immediately, but the real test was still to come, because out in the Atlantic, the wolfpacks were gathering, and they were hungry. The North Atlantic in March 1943 was a killing field, dressed in ice and fog. Convoy HX-229, 40 merchant vessels strong, ploughed eastward from Halifax toward Liverpool, its escort screen stretched thin by relentless U-boat attacks and the brutal arithmetic of attrition. Since January, Dönitz had unleashed his full might. Over 80 U-boats operating in coordinated wolfpacks, their crews hardened, their tactics refined, their confidence bordering on arrogance. The Allies were losing the tonnage war. And every ship that sank brought Britain closer to starvation. Aboard HMCS St. Croix, a town-class destroyer recently retrofitted with Elias Crowe's pump modification, leading mechanics mate Daniel Reeves checked the regulator valve for the third time that watch. He'd never met Crowe, but he'd memorized the installation diagram sent down from Western Approach's command. "Keep it tight, keep it quiet," the memo had read. "Your silence is your weapon," Reeves understood. He'd seen what happened to ships that weren't silent. At 11:47 p.m. on March 16th, the convoy entered the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap beyond the range of Allied air cover, where U-boats hunted with impunity. The sea was calm, the sky overcast, visibility less than a mile. Perfect conditions for murder. Below decks, the bilge pumps hummed steadily, their rhythm smoothed by the copper loop now standard on every escort. On the bridge, Commander Andrew R. Andy Hackney scanned the darkness with binoculars, his jaw clenched. He'd lost 2 ships already, SS Southern Princess and MV Empire Morn, both torpedoed within minutes of each other during a hard turn to avoid a spread from U-338. Hydrophone report. He barked. "Negative contact, sir," came the reply. "But there's something odd." "Odd how?" "The water's too quiet. Like the U-boats are holding their breath." Hackney frowned. That was the problem with silence. It could mean safety or ambush. 2 hours later, at 1:52 a.m., the ambush came, not with torpedoes, but with sound. U-603, lurking just 900 meters off St. Croix's starboard bow, reported via shortwave burst. Convoy detected. Bearings confirmed. Multiple targets executing evasive turns. Acoustic signature strong, especially from destroyer bearing 045. But the message was wrong, because St. Croix wasn't making noise. Unbeknownst to the U-boat commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Otto Westphalen, the destroyer's bilge system, was whispering nothing. The only sounds emanating from her hull were the muffled thrum of engines and the natural creak of stressed steel, sounds indistinguishable from oceanic. Background noise at ranges beyond 800 meters. Westphalen fired anyway. Trusting his hydrophone operator's ears, 2 torpedoes streaked through the dark. Both missed. Confused, Westphalen ordered a closer approach. But as U-603 crept forward, its own hydrophones picked up nothing. No engine harmonics, no pump pulses, no telltale rhythm of a ship under maneuver. It was as if St. Croix had dissolved into the sea. On the destroyer's bridge, Hackney received the sonar report. U-boat at 045, closing to 600 meters. Now 500, now. Gone? Gone? Vanished, sir. No acoustic trace. Hackney didn't understand, but he acted. Depth charges. Pattern Alpha, now! The charges tumbled into the sea, detonating with thunderous booms that lit the water in eerie flashes. Minutes later, debris surfaced. Wood, oil, a life jacket with a swastika. U-603 was dead. Word spread through the escort screen like current through copper wire. Ships with the new pump mods were surviving. Those without were being picked off. By dawn, Czechs 229 had lost 9 vessels, but not a single escort fitted with Crowe's modification had been targeted during evasion maneuvers. Meanwhile, in Liverpool, Elias Crowe sat in a cramped office at Derby House, analyzing after-action reports. He'd been reassigned as a technical advisor, his hands no longer greasy with oil, but stained with ink and cipher paper. He pored over sonar logs, U-boat intercepts, and damage assessments, searching for patterns, and he found one. Of the 27 Allied ships sunk in March 1943 that had executed hard turns during attacks, 24 had been using unmodified bilge systems. The other 3, all retrofitted. The data was undeniable, but Dönitz was not a man to ignore anomalies. By early April, German U-boat command issued a new directive: exercise caution when tracking convoys exhibiting irregular acoustic profiles. Suspect Allied countermeasures, hydrophone. Operators were ordered to cross-verify all pump-related signatures with visual sightings or radar. Confirmation it was the first crack in the wolfpacks' confidence, and Elias knew it wouldn't last, because the real test wasn't evasion, it was pursuit. Could a silent ship not only survive but hunt? The answer came in May. Convoy ONS-5, a slow, lumbering formation of 43 ships, was ambushed by a wolf pack of 30 U-boats in what would become known as Black May. For 7 days, the Atlantic boiled with depth charges, torpedoes, and desperate radio calls, but this time, the escorts were different. Every one of them, Canadian, British, Polish, had been fitted with the pressure-dampening loops. Their bilge systems whispered nothing. Their maneuvers left no acoustic trail, and they hunted like ghosts. On May 5th, HMCS Loch Alvey executed a hard turn to starboard, simulating a damaged vessel. U-125, lured by the feint, surfaced to finish the kill, only to find itself staring down the barrels of Loch Alvey's deck guns. The U-boat sank in under 3 minutes. On May 6th, HMS Vidette used silent zigzags to close within 300 meters of U-531 before unleashing a full depth charge pattern. The U-boat never heard her coming. By the end of the week, ONS-5 had lost 13 ships, but the escorts had sunk 7 U-boats, damaged 4 more, and forced the rest to scatter. For the first time in the war, the hunters had become the hunted, and at the heart of it all was the mechanic's quiet fix. A loop of copper tubing that turned noise into silence, and silence into survival. But Elias Crowe wasn't celebrating, because he knew the war wasn't over, and silence, like everything else, could be broken. By June 1943, the North Atlantic had grown unnervingly quiet. Not the silence of calm seas, but the silence of predators retreating. In the dimly lit operations room at Derby House, Rear Admiral Max Horton studied the latest convoy reports with a mixture of relief and wariness. Losses had plummeted, U-boat sinkings had spiked. Morale among escort crews, once brittle as ice on a gun barrel, had hardened into something resembling confidence. And yet Horton knew better than to trust silence. He'd fought Donitz long enough to understand that every lull was a prelude, every retreat a recalibration. Elias Crowe felt it too. Now stationed at the anti-submarine experimental establishment in Fairlie, Scotland, a cluster of stone buildings perched on the Firth of Clyde, where the wind carried the salt of the sea and the ghosts of sunken ships. Elias spent his days not in engine rooms, but in soundproof chambers lined with hydrophones, oscilloscopes, and reels of sonar tape. His hands, once calloused from wrenches and pipe fittings, now traced waveforms on graph paper, searching for the invisible fingerprints of acoustic deception. He'd been given a rank, warrant officer, technical, and a desk, but his mind remained in the bilges, listening. The success of his pump modification had spread faster than anyone anticipated. By May's end, over 300 Allied vessels, from Canadian corvettes to American Liberty ships, had been retrofitted with the pressure-dampening loop. The results were staggering. Ships executing hard turns during U-boat attacks no longer emitted the telltale harmonic pulse that had once broadcast their maneuvers like a drumbeat across the deep. Instead, they vanished acoustically, becoming phantoms in the sonar void. U-boat commanders, trained to anticipate the rhythm of evasion, found themselves chasing echoes that dissolved the moment they closed in. But Elias saw the flaw before anyone else. It was during a routine analysis of captured German radio traffic, decoded fragments from U-boat command in Lorient, that he noticed a shift in language. Early intercepts spoke of strong acoustic signatures or clear pump rhythms. Now, the phrases had changed. Irregular silence, suspicious quiet, phantom vessels. The enemy wasn't just adapting, they were weaponizing doubt. He brought his concerns to Commander Armitage, now head of acoustic countermeasures at Fairlie. They stood in the testing tank room, where a scale model of a river-class frigate floated in a 50-meter pool, its miniature bilge system wired to sensors. "They're learning," Elias said, pointing to a sonar log from U-438's final transmission before it was sunk off Iceland. "See this?" The operator notes, "Target turned starboard, pumps fell silent, too clean. Suspect decoy. They're starting to treat silence as a trap." Armitage frowned. So we've traded one vulnerability for another. Worse, Elias replied. We've created predictability. Every ship with our mod goes quiet at the same moment, during a turn. To a trained ear, that's not stealth. It's a pattern. The implications were chilling. If Donitz's hydrophone operators began correlating sudden silence with evasion maneuvers, they could reverse engineer the tactic, launching preemptive attacks just before a convoy zigzagged, or using the silence itself as a trigger to close in. The very thing that had saved 40 ships could become the noose that hanged the next 40. Elias spent 3 sleepless nights drafting a countermeasure. He called it the variable pulse modulator, a cam-driven mechanism that would intermittently engage and disengage the bilge pump during maneuvers, not to eliminate noise, but to scramble it. Instead of a clean silence, the ship would emit a randomized sequence of pulses, sometimes mimicking mechanical failure, sometimes echoing the rhythm of a different vessel class, sometimes falling silent for unpredictable intervals. The goal wasn't invisibility, but ambiguity. It's like static on a radio, he explained to Admiral Horton during an emergency briefing in Liverpool. You can't tune in if the signal keeps changing. Horton, ever pragmatic, asked the only question that mattered. Can you test it? Yes, sir. But it has to be real, not in a tank. In the Atlantic, the opportunity came with convoy SC-135, a slow-moving formation of 43 merchantmen bound for Liverpool from Sydney, Nova Scotia. 10 of its escorts, 5 Canadian, 3 British, 2 Polish, were quietly fitted with Elias's prototype modulators in the days before departure. The crews were told only that they were testing new bilge efficiency protocols. No one mentioned U-boats. No one mentioned sound. On July 12, 1943, SC-135 sailed into the teeth of the mid-Atlantic summer gales. For the first 3 days, nothing. The ocean was empty, the skies grey, the tension thick as fog. Then on the evening of July 15th, the hydrophone operator aboard HMCS Saint Laurent picked up the familiar whisper, a low-frequency hum, then the sharp click of a bearing fix. U-boat, closing. Captain James McLeod gave the order. Execute pattern Delta. Hard turn to port. As the convoy banked, the modulators engaged. On the sonar screens of the U-boats shadowing the fleet, U-230, U-527, and U-634, the acoustic picture dissolved into chaos. One destroyer sounded like it was flooding. Another pulsed like a dying engine. A third fell silent, then roared back to life with a rhythm that matched no known Allied class. Captain Lieutenant Rolf Strasser of U-230 hesitated. His hydrophone operator, usually unflappable, was visibly agitated. It's not one ship, Herr Kalou. It's like 3 ships arguing in the dark. Strasser, a veteran of the happy time, had never encountered anything like it. He ordered a cautious approach, but every time he narrowed in on a target, its acoustic signature shifted. Was it damaged? Was it bait? Was it even real? He never got the chance to decide. HMS Duncan, running silent except for its randomized pump pulses, had used the confusion to close within 400 meters. At 22:17, it unleashed a full-depth charge pattern. The explosions lit the sea like underwater lightning. U-230 never surfaced again. Over the next 72 hours, the same scene repeated itself. U-527, lured by what it thought was a crippled freighter, surfaced only to find itself under fire from HMCS Ottawa. U-634, attempting to flank the convoy, lost track of its targets entirely and was depth-charged by the Polish destroyer ORP Garland, after blindly firing a torpedo that missed by a mile. By the time SC-135 reached the western approaches, it had lost only 2 ships, both to straggler attacks before the modulators were fully active. The escorts had sunk 3 U-boats and forced 2 more to abort. Most importantly, not a single ship fitted with the variable pulse modulator had been targeted during a maneuver. Back in Fairley, Elias pored over the after-action sonar tapes, his heart pounding not with pride but with dread. Because he knew what came next. If this worked, the Germans would respond. And their response would be faster, smarter, and deadlier. He was right. In August, Bletchley Park decrypted a high-priority signal from Dönitz himself. All U-boat crews must assume Allied acoustic deception is now standard. Trust only visual confirmation or radar contact. Hydrophone data alone is unreliable. It was a retreat, but also a pivot. Within weeks, U-boats began surfacing at night to use radar detectors and lookouts, gambling that darkness would shield them from Allied aircraft. It was a desperate move, and it cost them dearly. Dozens were spotted and sunk by RAF liberators flying from Iceland. But it proved one thing. Elias's invention had broken the acoustic dominance that had defined the Battle of the Atlantic for 3 long years. By September, Western Approaches Command mandated the variable pulse modulator on all new escort builds and began retrofitting the entire fleet. The cost, less than $2 per ship. The impact, incalculable, yet through it all Elias remained invisible. His name appeared nowhere in official dispatches. His innovation was catalogued as Engineering Directive 43 Alpha, credited to a committee of naval engineers. When journalists came asking about the secret weapon that silenced ships, they were steered toward radar experts, code breakers, and convoy commodores. Elias didn't mind. He'd never wanted fame. He'd only wanted the water to stop rising in the bilges of dying ships. But as autumn deepened and the war turned inexorably toward Europe, he couldn't shake the feeling that his work was not done, because silence, he now understood, was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something waiting to be heard, and somewhere, in the vast, cold dark between continents, the sea was still listening. In the winter of 1944, Elias Crowe stood on the windswept dock at Greenock, watching the last of the retrofitted corvettes steam out toward the Arctic convoys, their hulls painted in the dull grey of steel and salt, their decks slick with frost, their smokestacks belching plumes that dissolved into the low-hanging clouds like ghosts released from the sea. Snow dusted his shoulders like ash, clinging to the wool of his overcoat, melting slowly against the warmth of his skin, a warmth he hadn't felt in years, not since the North Atlantic had seeped into his bones and settled there, cold and permanent. The war was shifting. Normandy loomed, the Pacific burned with firestorms and kamikazes, and the Atlantic, once a charnel house where ships vanished without a trace, had become a highway again. Convoys moved in daylight now, escorted by radar-equipped destroyers and shadowed by RAF liberators flying from Iceland. U-boats, when they dared surface, did so with the furtiveness of rats in a flooded cellar, hunted, harried, their crews hollow-eyed and desperate. Their tactics reduced to guesswork and prayer. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt the weight of all the voices he'd silenced, not just the pumps, but the men who'd drowned before anyone listened. He remembered the faces, not the officers, not the admirals, but the ordinary ones. The radio operator whose last transmission crackled with static before cutting off mid-sentence. The cook who'd handed him a cup of tea before the Empire Redshank went down, smiling as if he knew it would be his last. The stoker boy from Liverpool, barely 16, who'd asked Elias how long until they reached port and never got an answer because the ship sank beneath them before dawn. These were the ghosts that followed him now, not in dreams, but in the rhythm of the waves, in the groan of metal under stress, in the way a bilge pump coughed when it was about to fail. He carried them with him, not as burdens, but as reminders of what happens when no one listens. He'd been offered a permanent commission, a desk job at the Admiralty, a title, a pension, even a teaching position at the Royal Naval Engineering College in Plymouth, where young officers would learn the science of sound and silence. He declined them all. When the war ended in May 1945, he packed his sea bag, the same one he'd carried since St. John, turned in his warrant, and boarded a train back to New Brunswick without fanfare, without farewell. No parade, no handshake from the First Sea Lord, no mention in the Naval Review. Just a quiet exit, like a man slipping out of a church after the service has ended, leaving only the echo of hymns behind. For 30 years, he ran a small garage on Water Street in St. John, fixing carburetors, rebuilding transmissions, and occasionally tuning the radios of local fishermen who swore his hands could find a dead wire by ear. He married late, to a schoolteacher named Margaret, who loved books and hated the sea, and though they tried, they never had children. It wasn't for lack of wanting. It was as if the ocean had claimed his future, along with his youth. He never spoke of the war, not really. When asked, he'd say only, "I kept the engines running," and if pressed further, he'd add, "The pumps were the problem. I fixed them," but the sea never left him. On foggy mornings, he'd walk to the harbour and stand at the edge of the wharf, listening, not to the gulls or the trawlers or the distant hum of diesel engines, but to the water itself, to the way it lapped against the pilings, the way it sighed through the gaps in the docks, the way it whispered secrets only those who'd spent years below decks could hear. And sometimes, in the rhythm of it all, in the ebb and flow, the rise and fall, the pulse of the tide, he'd hear it again, the faint, stuttering pulse of a bilge pump failing in the dark, the sound that had started everything. It wasn't memory, it was resonance, a frequency embedded in his bones, a vibration that refused to fade. He never knew how many ships his fix had truly saved. The official estimate, 40, was likely conservative. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Navy's Operational Research Group, declassified in 1972, suggested the number could be as high as 53. When accounting for secondary effects, convoys that reached port with intact fuel reserves, enabling longer-range air patrols, escorts that survived to protect subsequent convoys, U-boat crews demoralized by phantom targets and withdrawn from the front lines. But numbers were never the point. The point was the cook who made it home to Halifax, the radio operator who sent one last message to his mother, the boy in Liverpool who ate bread because a freighter didn't sink. These were the victories Elias carried, not in medals, but in memory, not in headlines, but in the quiet moments when someone else lived because he had listened. In 1978, a man named Daniel Reeves found him. Reeves, now a retired naval historian, had spent years tracing the origins of Engineering Directive 43 Alpha. He'd read the logs, interviewed surviving crewmen from Assiniboine and St. Croix, and pieced together the story of the mechanic who'd outlistened the admirals. He'd tracked Elias through old pay records, pension files, and a single faded photograph tucked inside a Naval Museum archive, a grainy, black-and-white shot of a young man in oil-stained overalls, standing beside a bilge pump, holding a wrench like a scepter. The caption read, "Mechanic's Mate E. Crowe, HMCS Chaudière, February 1943, credited with acoustic modification prototype." They met in the garage, surrounded by oil cans and tire irons, the scent of gasoline and machine grease thick in the air. Reeves brought photographs of Loch Alvy's engine room, of Rutherford's handwritten notes, of the copper loop still mounted on a pump in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. He showed Elias the sonar logs from SC-135, the intercepted German radio traffic, the post-war reports that called his invention the most cost-effective anti-submarine innovation of the war. He even brought a letter from Admiral Horton's personal papers, a single line scrawled in pencil. Crowe's mod changed the game. No medal, no name, just results. "You changed the war," Reeves said. Elias shook his head. "I just fixed a pump, but you saw what no one else did." "I listened," Elias corrected gently. "That's all." Reeves stayed for hours, and before he left, he asked the question that had haunted him since 1943. "Why didn't you fight for recognition?" "You deserved it." Elias looked out the window at the Bay of Fundy, where the tide was turning as it always did, relentless, indifferent, eternal. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up a worn, leather-bound notebook from his workbench, the same one he'd filled during the war, its pages yellowed with age, its margins crammed with equations, sketches, and observations. He opened it to a page near the end, where a single sentence was underlined twice, in bold ink. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of something waiting to be heard. He closed the book. "Men don't drown because the sea is loud," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They drown because no one's listening." Reeves understood then. Elias hadn't wanted fame. He hadn't wanted credit. He'd wanted the water to stop rising in the bilges of dying ships. And he'd done it, not with grand gestures or speeches, but with a loop of copper tubing, a regulator valve, and the quiet courage to notice what others ignored. He died 2 years later, quietly, in his sleep, in the small house he and Margaret had shared for 28 years. His garage was sold. His tools were scattered, some to local mechanics, others to museums, a few to collectors who didn't know their value. But his story, long buried in footnotes and technical bulletins, began to resurface, first in academic papers, then in documentaries, then in the quiet conversations of engineers who still teach that the most powerful innovations often begin with a single anomaly, noticed by someone with nothing but time and attention. Today, on the restored deck of HMCS Sackville, the last surviving Flower-class corvette, a small plaque near the engine room reads, "In memory of those who kept the pumps running so others could keep fighting." It doesn't name Elias Crowe, but those who know. In the archives of the Royal Canadian Navy, in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Technical Notes, 1943, lies his water-stained notebook, its pages filled with sketches of copper loops, frequency charts, and that single underlined sentence. And in the halls of the anti-submarine experimental establishment at Fairleigh, where new generations of naval engineers study acoustic warfare, his name appears in the margins of training manuals, not as an inventor, but as a case study, the Crowe principle, observation over authority. History rarely remembers the mechanics. It remembers admirals, generals, presidents, the voices that boom from podiums and fill headlines. But the truth of war, like the truth of the sea, is written in quieter tones, in the hum of a well-tuned engine, in the absence of a fatal pulse, in the hands of a man who chose to listen when everyone else was shouting. Elias Crowe never sought a legacy. But in the 40 ships that didn't sink, in the thousands who came home because the water didn't rise, in the very silence that now blankets the Atlantic like a shroud of peace, he left one anyway. And perhaps that is the most enduring kind of victory. Not the kind that echoes in halls of power, but the kind that whispers through the bilges of history, reminding us that sometimes the smallest fix can hold back the deepest dark. It makes you wonder, how many other silent heroes are out there, unnoticed, uncredited, their inventions lost to bureaucracy or indifference? How many solutions are already in plain sight, waiting for someone to listen? If this story gave you chills, if it reminded you that greatness doesn't always wear medals, then do yourself a favor. Subscribe. Because the next forgotten hero? They're already waiting, and someone needs to tell their story.